My son flew from Toronto to Cebu because he believed something had gone wrong. On the second evening after he landed, he set my Canadian passport on the kitchen counter. Not the table, the counter, because my apartment in Cebu doesn't have a proper table yet. And he said, "Dad, I've already looked at Friday's flight. There are still seats." He said it quietly, the way you say something you've rehearsed but still aren't sure about. I looked at the passport, then at him, then at the power of attorney documents he'd placed beside it. He had those prepared by a lawyer in Toronto. I hadn't known about the papers until that moment. My name is Gerald. I was 67 years old, retired, and recently divorced when I left Mississauga, Ontario, and moved to the Philippines. I want to say that slowly enough for it to land properly. Recently divorced, not widowed. Beverly and I had been together for 31 years. We raised 2 children in the same split-level house on Martindale Crescent, attended the same church for 2 decades, shared the same pot of morning coffee every single day. Then, 7 months before I booked my flight to Cebu, she sat across from me at that kitchen table and told me she hadn't been happy for a very long time. She wasn't cruel about it. Beverly has never been cruel. That almost made it harder. Matthew is our son. He's 39, works in software development in downtown Toronto, and he handled the divorce by immediately becoming practical about everything: the house sale, the asset division, the question of where I was going to live. My daughter, Fiona, who is 35 and lives in Calgary with her husband and 2 boys, handled it by calling me every few days and asking whether I was eating. I was grateful for both of them. I was also, for the first time in my adult life, genuinely unsure of who I was without the architecture of the life I had built. I had worked as a senior accountant for a construction firm for 28 years. I retired the year before the divorce, which had seemed like good timing at the time. After Beverly left, I discovered what early retirement without a partner actually felt like. It felt like standing in a very clean, very quiet room with nowhere to be and no one expecting you anywhere. My CPP and OAS payments came in on schedule. The pension from my firm covered anything the government benefits didn't. Financially, I was more secure than most people I knew. Emotionally, I was running on fumes. I started watching videos about living abroad. I'm not sure when it became a plan instead of a distraction, but somewhere around February I found myself on a forum for Canadian expats in Southeast Asia, reading budget breakdowns and neighborhood guides, like they were research documents instead of daydreams. By March, I was talking to a property management company about renting out my condo. By April, I had a one-way ticket to Cebu City. I told Matthew first. He asked if this was about Beverly. I said no. He asked if there was someone else. I said no. He went quiet for a long moment and then said, "Dad, you don't have to run away." I wasn't running away. I was trying to find out whether there was still something left of me that had nothing to do with the marriage, or the career, or being someone's father. I didn't know how to explain that without sounding like I was in the middle of some kind of crisis, so I said I'd call him when I landed. For the first few weeks in Cebu, everything was louder and brighter and more complicated than I had expected. The jeepneys didn't follow a logic I could decode. The heat was different from anything I'd felt in Ontario. Not just hot, but present, like weather you had to negotiate with. Simple tasks took twice as long because I didn't know where anything was, and my body kept defaulting to routines that no longer applied. I bought groceries from the wrong market, got on the wrong jeepney twice in the same afternoon, and once sat at a cafe table for 40 minutes before realizing it was someone's private dining room. But I kept going back out. That was the thing I noticed about myself. I kept going out. In Mississauga, after Beverly left, I had started to stay in. The condo was comfortable, and I had everything I needed, and there was no particular reason to leave, and that lack of reason had started to feel like a weight I carried from room to room. In Cebu, going out was necessary. It was the only way anything happened. I found a small cafe near my apartment that opened early. The owner, a woman named Lagaya, made coffee that was stronger than anything from back home, and she had a habit of chatting with everyone who came in, whether they wanted conversation or not. By my third week, she was waving me over before I reached the counter. By my second month, she was telling me which of her other regulars I might get along with, like she was running a slow-motion matchmaking service for friendships. That was how I met Nestor. He was 56, a former merchant marine who had come back to Cebu after his years at sea, and now ran a small community center near a barangay market a few kilometers from my apartment. He spoke English fluently and had an inexhaustible curiosity about everything. The first time we had a real conversation, he kept asking me questions about Canadian winters, with the focused attention of someone who had only read about snow in books. I asked him questions about the shipping routes he'd sailed. We ended up talking for 3 hours and missing lunch entirely. Nestor introduced me to his wife Maricel, a secondary school teacher with a warm, efficient manner that reminded me of the best project managers I had worked with over the years. They had 3 grown children and lived in a house about 20 minutes from my apartment by tricycle. The first time they invited me for dinner, I tried to leave after 2 hours because I didn't want to impose. Maricel looked at me like I'd said something slightly ridiculous, put more food on my plate, and said, "You're not leaving while there's still rice in the pot." After that, Sunday dinners became a standing arrangement that nobody formally agreed to, but everyone simply kept showing up for. I should say something about money, because Matthew certainly thought about it. My monthly income was roughly 2,600 Canadian dollars combined, CPP, OAS, and my firm's pension. In Mississauga, that barely covered my condo fees and groceries. In Cebu, my rent was around $350 Canadian. Utilities ran another 100. Food cost me less than I used to spend in a week back home, and I had enough left over each month to keep a healthy amount in a Canadian savings account that I held alone and that no one else could access. My condo in Mississauga was being managed by a professional property management company. I had never transferred money to anyone in the Philippines. I had never been asked to. What I had done 8 months in was give Nestor and Maricel a spare key to my apartment. That detail would become the center of everything. Fiona noticed I was calling less. Matthew noticed I sounded different. He said I sounded distracted, which I think he meant as a criticism but which I received as a compliment. I was distracted. I was busy. A few months after arriving, one of Nestor's contacts at the community center was a woman who coordinated a small business skills program for local vendors, sari-sari store owners, market sellers, people running small operations with no formal business background. She asked if I had any accounting knowledge. I told her I had 28 years of it. She asked if I'd be willing to run a monthly session on basic bookkeeping and financial record keeping. I said yes, mostly because I had nothing else planned that week. Then I started looking forward to it. The vendors had sharp, practical minds and no patience for theory. They wanted to understand their actual cash flow, not hypothetical ledgers. I had to relearn how to teach rather than advise. And somewhere in that process I rediscovered something I hadn't felt since my last year at the firm, the particular satisfaction of being genuinely useful. There is a difference between being present in someone's life and being needed in it. My children had never stopped loving me. But in Mississauga after the divorce, I had felt neither present nor needed anywhere that mattered. I did not tell Matthew or Fiona about any of this in any real detail. When Matthew asked what I was doing with my time, I said I was keeping busy. He asked if I was staying safe. I said yes. Both answers were true. Neither answer gave him anything to hold on to. Then, about 2 months ago, I had a blood pressure episode. It wasn't serious. I felt dizzy one morning after walking back from the market in the heat, sat down on a low wall, waited until it passed, and then went to a clinic near my apartment. The doctor adjusted my medication slightly and told me to stay out of direct sun during the hottest part of the afternoon. Nestor went with me because he happened to be nearby when I called. I was back in my apartment within 2 hours. I did not tell Matthew or Fiona. I told myself it wasn't significant enough to mention. The truth was that I knew exactly how it would sound from 12,000 kilometers away, and I wasn't ready for the conversation it would start. Every small thing I kept to myself added another layer to a story my children were building in my absence, and I kept adding to it without realizing how dark that story was becoming. Matthew arrived on a Thursday. Fiona had wanted to come too, but couldn't leave her boys on short notice, so she stayed on the phone with Matthew for most of his flight. They had been talking to each other for weeks about things they weren't saying to me, that I'd become harder to reach, that I'd sounded evasive on calls, that someone had posted a warning in a Canadian expat group about foreigners being targeted by scammers in Cebu, that they'd found the post alarming even though it had nothing to do with me specifically. Matthew had spoken to our family doctor back in Mississauga, who reminded him that blood pressure issues could escalate quickly at my age and that it was worth checking in. He landed at Mactan Airport and took a taxi straight to my apartment without telling me what time he was coming. I opened the door and found him standing there with a carry-on bag and the look of someone who has been practicing calm for several hours and is beginning to lose it around the edges. We hugged. I made coffee. He looked around the apartment slowly, the way you look at something when you're counting problems rather than taking in the room. He asked about the stairs. My apartment was on the second floor and the staircase was steep. He asked why there was no carbon monoxide detector. He noticed the bathroom tiles and said nothing but took out his phone. Before we had finished the coffee, he was photographing things. That evening, Maricel knocked on my door. I was in the back of the apartment looking for something, so I called out what I always called out. Maricel, come in, the keys on top of the frame. Without thinking about how that would land, she let herself in with the spare key she kept for emergencies, carrying a pot of soup and a container of rice, because she knew I had a visitor, and as she put it later, visitors need proper food. Matthew was staring at the key in her hand before she'd even set the pot down. Who is she? He said quietly. Not to Maricel, to me. Maricel introduced herself with the composure of someone who has navigated awkward situations her whole life, placed the key on the counter, and told Matthew she was glad he had come to visit. She gave him her phone number and said if he couldn't reach me for any reason, he should call her directly. Then she left. The room was very quiet. Matthew picked up the key. Why does she have this? I explained about the blood pressure morning. I explained about the clinic. I explained that Nestor had been with me, that the doctor had adjusted my medication, that I was fine. Watching my son's face as I told him was one of the harder things I've done in recent years. He wasn't angry at first. He was just still, the way you go still when you find out something, and you're calculating how long it was kept from you. The power of attorney documents came out that night. He'd had them prepared before he left Toronto, just as a precaution, he said. They weren't about doubting me, he said. They were about making sure that if something happened and I couldn't communicate, someone could act on my behalf. He put them on the counter next to the spot where Maricel's key had been. I looked at them for a long time. I told him I wasn't signing anything. He said I was being stubborn. I told him I had managed my own finances for 40 years, and I was not going to hand over legal authority over them because he'd spent a week reading posts about expat scammers. He said this wasn't about posts. He said this was about me hiding a medical episode, giving a spare key to people he'd never met, and going to a clinic in a foreign country, accompanied by a man whose last name I hadn't even mentioned to Matthew until 30 seconds ago. I told him that Nestor had been a better neighbor to me in 8 months than most people on Martintel Crest had been in 15 years. He said that was exactly what worried him. We didn't eat the soup that night. We sat across from each other while the ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, And I thought about how far we had traveled from the people we used to be comfortable being around each other, and how much of that distance I had created myself by keeping small truths in separate compartments where no one could put them together and get frightened. The next morning, Matthew asked to see my bank statements. I refused. He asked whether I had ever been approached for money. I said no. He pulled out his phone and showed me 3 articles he'd saved. A retired teacher from Victoria who lost over $180,000 to a friendship fraud in Southeast Asia, a couple from Edmonton targeted in a similar scheme. I read them carefully. I handed the phone back. I told him those things were real, and they happened, and I had been paying attention from the beginning, precisely because I knew they could happen to someone who wasn't. He said, "How do I know you're paying attention?" I said, "Because I'm still here and I still have all my money." That was not the right answer, but it was the only honest one I had. We agreed on 3 days. Matthew would stop pushing, and I would show him everything: where I went, what I spent, who I knew, what my actual medical situation was. After 3 days, we would talk about the flight again. He agreed, but only on the condition that he was allowed to have doubts and say so if he found something real. I agreed to that too. The next morning I took him to the cafe, where Ligaya knew my order before I reached the counter. I took him to the community center, where Nestor introduced him to the program coordinator, who explained in precise and confident detail that his father had given their small business vendors practical accounting knowledge they'd previously had to pay professionals to access. Matthew looked at the handwritten ledger sheets. He looked at the notes on the whiteboard. He looked at the way people said good morning to me when I walked through the door, not as a guest, but as someone with a reason to be there. He didn't say much, but he put his phone in his pocket. I took him through the rest of my typical week. The market where the vendor remembered I didn't like coriander. The pharmacy where they kept my prescription records on file. The clinic where the doctor had treated my blood pressure episode, and where she met Matthew and walked him through exactly what had happened and what the follow-up plan was. By mid-afternoon, my son had stopped walking slightly ahead of me, scanning ahead, checking, and had started walking beside me. That evening, I opened my laptop and showed him everything. My Canadian account. No unexplained withdrawals, no unusual transfers, no activity I hadn't initiated. The rental income from the Mississauga condo handled cleanly through the management company. My monthly expenses in Cebu laid out in a spreadsheet because I am, at heart, still an accountant. The numbers told a story he hadn't expected. I was spending less in a month than I used to spend in a week in Ontario, and I was not in debt to anyone. He studied the statements for nearly an hour. When he closed the laptop, he said, "Financially, this actually looks fine." He said it like he was slightly surprised by his own conclusion. "I know," I said. "That's not everything," he said. He was right. It wasn't. That night, after Matthew had gone to bed, I left my journal on the coffee table. I don't know whether it was an accident or something else. I've been keeping a journal since Beverly left. Not every day, but often enough to fill most of a year. Matthew found it the next morning before I was up. When I came out of the bedroom, he was sitting by the window with it open in his hands, and he looked like someone who had been crying quietly and had stopped only recently. He said, "Dad, you write about us all the time." I do. I write about Matthew's work calls, about Fiona's boys, about the Sunday afternoon she sent me a video of my grandson learning to skate, and I watched it 4 times in a row. I write about the moments I miss my children so much it feels structural, like something load-bearing has briefly given way, and I write, just as often, about why I need to stay. Not because the Philippines is better than Canada, not because the people here matter more than my family, but because here, for the first time since Beverly left, I woke up each morning, knowing what I was going to do that day, and believing it mattered to someone outside my own 4 walls. Matthew set the journal down. He said, "I didn't know you were lonely." "Not like that." I said I know. I wasn't very good at showing it. He asked why I hadn't told him about the blood pressure episode. I told him through truth. I was afraid that one small thing would become justification for a much larger conversation, and I wasn't ready to have that conversation on someone else's terms. He said the problem was that by the time he found out, the small thing had grown into evidence of everything else he was already afraid of. He said Fiona had been quietly looking at assisted living facilities in Calgary, not to force anything, just to know what existed. He said she cried on the phone to him after I missed 2 calls in the same week. That was the most honest conversation my son and I had had in years, possibly ever. The following afternoon, Nestor had us both over at the community center. Nothing formal, just rice and grilled fish and whatever Maricel had sent over in a container. Matthew helped Nestor fix a loose shelf bracket while I sat with 2 of the vendors from the bookkeeping sessions, going over a question about inventory tracking. At some point I looked across the room and saw my son laughing at something Nestor had said, holding a screwdriver, genuinely at ease in a way he hadn't been since he'd arrived. On the walk back, Matthew said, "He's not what I expected." I asked what he'd expected. He thought about it honestly. Someone with an angle. Nestor doesn't have an angle. What Nestor has is a lot of questions about Canada, and a genuine interest in anyone who might have answers. Matthew, it turned out, had answers. By the time we got back to my apartment, my son had agreed to send Nestor some information about maritime engineering programs in Ontario that Nestor's youngest was interested in. That evening, the power of attorney documents were still on the counter. Matthew picked them up, looked at them for a moment, and put them back in his carry-on bag. He didn't ask me to sign them. He didn't say anything about them. Later, sitting on my small balcony with the sound of the street coming up from below, he said, "I still don't like those stairs." I said, "I've been looking at ground-floor apartments." He asked if I was serious. I said I'd been meaning to move for a couple of months. The second floor had been the only vacancy when I arrived, and the stairs and the occasional power outages had been on my list of things to deal with. We spent the next hour making a realistic list together. A new apartment, a weekly video call that I would actually answer, a complete copy of my medical records shared with both Matthew and Fiona. Nestor added as a local emergency contact at the clinic with instructions to call my children if they couldn't reach me directly. I agreed to every item, not because Matthew had pressured me into it, but because these were things I should have arranged 8 months ago, and the cost of pretending I didn't need them was the expression on my son's face when he'd landed at Mactan Airport. Friday came. I drove with Matthew to the airport in a taxi, and we sat in the departures area over bad coffee and said the things that had been accumulating since he arrived. He said he was sorry for coming with a lawyer's paperwork instead of just coming. I said I was sorry for making him feel like the paperwork might be necessary. He said he was going to stop expecting me to need rescuing and start expecting me to answer the phone on Sundays. I said that was a reasonable trade. At the gate, he hugged me the way he used to when he was about 12, and thought he was too old for it but did it anyway. He told me Fiona was going to call me that evening, and I should pick up. I told him I would. I watched him go through security until he disappeared around the corner. Then I walked back out to the arrivals area where Nestor was waiting with his car running and a thermos of coffee on the passenger seat because Maricel had insisted. 3 weeks later, I moved into a ground-floor apartment 6 blocks from the old one. It has a safer bathroom, proper handrails at the entrance, and a spare room with a real bed for when Matthew or Fiona visits. I sealed a spare key in a small lockbox mounted outside the door, with the code shared only with Nestor and with both of my children. Our Sunday video calls are part of my schedule now. Last week, Matthew and Fiona were both on at the same time, and we talked for over an hour about nothing in particular. My grandson's skating lessons, a project Matthew was finishing, a recipe Maricel had given me that I'd managed to make almost correctly. At one point, Maricel walked through the background, and Fiona asked about her, and the three of them talked for 10 minutes about teaching, while I sat back and watched the two parts of my life speak to each other without suspicion for the first time. Matthew came to Cebu, believing his father was somewhere he couldn't see clearly. He was right about that, but not in the way he'd imagined. What he couldn't see wasn't a scam, or a deteriorating situation, or a man who had lost his judgment. What he couldn't see was a life being rebuilt, quietly and imperfectly, out of early mornings and wrong turns and Sunday lunches and ledger sheets that mattered to the people who used them. He didn't bring me back to Canada. He helped me make the life I'd already built safer and more honest, which is the only kind of help that actually lasts. Growing older means taking safety seriously, but there is a version of being protected that removes everything it is protecting from the room. That is not safety. That is just a different kind of empty. My son came here to bring me home. He left knowing I already was.